Hello everyone, welcome to Global Government News. Today is Thursday, February 17th, 2011, and I'm Darko. Welcome everyone to this news bulletin. I usually ask my audience to check out my website, www.ggnonline.com. I know it gets redundant, but I have to keep saying it in the beginning just for new listeners that come by. It's www.ggnonline.com, and this is my website right here, and this is a poll. What country will be the next to go through a regime change similar to Egypt? And as of right now, from what I have listed, it's Tunisia and then Yemen and then possibly Pakistan. But we have this, it's a pretty much a number that's growing is 17%, a country that is not listed, and of course that's what Bahrain and Libya as of right now, and possibly Jordan. So check it out. I usually post all my links for my website, so you can go and check those out. We're going to start off with the economy, and then we're going to move into, in part two, we'll move into the Middle East crisis or the staged revolution, and then in the last part we'll talk about some solar flares, news with the sun, and other stories as well that I think you may find interesting. So we have Wall Street ends higher on market optimism, and it says U.S. investors piled on dizzying two-year advance in stocks on Thursday, using a brief slip on negative economic news as an opportunity to buy into market leaders. And I came across an article that said, this whole crisis can be used as an opportunity, much like Kissinger and them say, right? And Rahm Emanuel, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And it says here, Swiss franc treasuries gain on amid East tensions, and it says the safe haven Swiss franc and the U.S. government bonds rallied on Thursday, while crude oil prices rose as unrest in the Middle East and tensions between Israel and Iran escalated. And that's a story that we'll get into definitely. Right now, Iran's asking for permission to go to the Suez Canal, and it's kind of freaking out Israel, who's already freaked out with Israel and Mubarak, who they supported, basically being ousted. Precious metals get heavy. Investors have been flocking to precious metals as a safe haven, boosting prices for the likes of gold and platinum. And then we have this, BHP, Bulletin profit up 72%. Global resources giant BHP, Bulletin, on Wednesday reported record results for the 6 month ended December 2010, with basic earnings per share up 71%. And it said the group also announced its plan to repurchase 10 billion of its shares by the end of the year. Gold climbs, silver touches 30-year high amid inflation concern. Then we have China gold demand skyrockets. Gold is making headway in China as rising inflation and currency appreciation risk, making the metal a more attractive alternative for investors, placing the country in a position to challenge India as the world's largest gold consumer. Then we have U.S. oil jumps on Mideast Africa turmoil. Treasuries rise on Mideast jitters. And we have China continues to cut U.S. Treasury holdings. China dumped U.S. Treasury securities in December, cutting its holdings for the second month in a row. And then it says here the Treasury Department officials said Tuesday that China had reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasuries by $4 billion to $891 billion in December, after selling off $11 billion worth in November. Despite the sell-offs, China remains the largest holder of America's debt. And we're going to move on here to mortgages. Mortgage rates ease a bit, and it said mortgage rates declined in the latest week, with the average rate of a 30-year fixed rate mortgages landing 5%, according to Freddie Mac's weekly survey. Mortgage delinquencies decline, and the number of U.S. households behind on mortgage payments fell during the fourth quarter to the lowest level in 2 years, buoyed by the broader economic recovery. U.S. loans in foreclosure tie record. Lenders delay seizures. It says here, jobless claims rise 25,000 last week. New U.S. claims for unemployment benefits rose more than expected last week, according to a government report on Thursday that still pointed at gradual labor market recovery. So we have jobless claims tick back above 400,000. The number of Americans filing first-time claims for unemployment benefits edged up last week, the government said. And then we have this, U.S. consumer prices, jobless claims exceed forecasts. Rising global demand for food and fuel push up the U.S. cost of living more than forecasted in January, a sign the risk of a damaging drop in prices is ebbing. And it says here, energy push up consumer prices. U.S. consumer prices continue to rise in January as energy and food prices increase, but underlying inflation remained tame as many companies struggle to pass on higher raw material costs to consumers. And airlines rolling back latest fare increase, and it says major U.S. airlines are rolling back a fare increase of up to $120 per trip on tickets favored by business travelers. And then we have Consumer Price Index summary, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, directly from the government. This is the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers increased 0.4% in January on a seasonally adjusted basis. The U.S. Bureau of Statistics reported today over the last 12 months, the all items index increased 1.6% for before seasonal adjustment. It says here increases in index is basically for energy commodities and for food accounted for over 2/3 of all items increased. It said the index for gasoline and fuel both increased in January, continuing their recent strong upward trend. The index for food at home posted its largest increase in over 2 years, with all 6 major grocery store food group indexes rising. And it says, finished up here, the index for all items less food and energy also rose in January. The indexes for apparel, i.e. clothes, shelter, houses and renting, travel, airline fares, and recreation all posted increases. In contrast, the indexes for new vehicles and for used cars and trucks declined in January. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all we're going to cover for here. You can check that out. The link will be posted. Consumer prices show inflation turning up. So now the mainstream media is finally talking about what I've been reporting on for the past, month, 2 months, if not longer. It says core consumer prices rose at the quickest pace in 15 months in January, suggesting a long period of slowing inflation had run its course. So this is the highlight of this economic little news part in this first video, is the rising food prices. It's all over the news now. Rising food prices push millions into poverty, study says. A sharp rise in food prices since June has pushed 44 million people in developing countries into extreme poverty, having to live on less than $1.25 a day, according to a new study by the World Bank. And then we have Bank of England warns of rise in cost. Bank of England has warned that the prices are to increase dramatically in the immediate future, and the inflation would also increase by 6%. So they're telling people. I mean, hopefully, if you're a little skeptical about the quote recovery, the economic recovery, just listen to your government. I hate to say that. I usually don't recommend to listen to your government, but they're telling you basically that inflation is here and that the prices are going up and that they're going to continue to go up. They're going to increase interest rates. It's not going to be good. It's not looking good as far as just the average person being able to get by in the near future. It says here, cyclone floods may add 0.5% to inflation, Reserve Bank says. Central Bank says recent extreme weather events are likely to add 0.5 percentage point to inflation in the short term. Reserve Bank Assistant Governor Philip Lowe said the Consumer Price Index was expected to be around 3% over the year to June 2011. Food prices pushed 44 million into poverty. We covered that. Asia's poor suffer as food prices drive inflation. Surging food prices in India are forcing families to cut back on meat and vegetables, and it's also in China. In Indonesia, they prompted the president to urge people to grow their own chili peppers, and in China, restaurant owners are feeling the squeeze. So you can check that out. Links posted. And look at this. Democrats flee Madison, Wisconsin, with police chasing them. It says so vote can be taken to curtail public employees' unions. So a lot going on over there. It says here protests swell to 25,000 people at Wisconsin Capitol. And it says here authorities say an estimated 25,000 people are protesting anti-union legislation at the Wisconsin State Capitol, and 9 demonstrators have been arrested on the third day of protests. The State House was completely jammed with protesters opposed to a bill that would strip public employees of their collective bargaining rights. The crowd filled the building hallways, sat cross-legged across the floor, and chanted slogans. And then an update is that a group of Wisconsin lawmakers blocked passage of a sweeping anti-union bill Thursday by ignoring orders to attend a vote, and instead left the state to force Republicans to negotiate over the proposals. So they pretty much didn't show up. And banks push home buyers to put down more cash. Now you need more money to pretty much get a mortgage. The down payments demanded by banks to buy homes have ballooned since the housing bust, forcing many people to rethink what they can afford and potentially shrinking the pool of eligible buyers. And we have IMF warns of growing risk, would welcome weakened dollar. Oh, is that right? The IMF will warn G20 finance ministers this weekend of growing risk to the world economy from surging food prices and public finances, while also advocating a somewhat weaker dollar. Greece, EU, IMF exceeded their role. Greece has accused the European Union and the IMF of exceeding their duties by calling for massive privatization to ease the country's debt burden. Quote, the EU, European Central Bank, and IMF representatives have gone beyond their role. AFP quoted Greek Finance Minister George P. as saying on Monday, quote, they have acted in a unilateral manner on questions which are solely the Greek government's responsibility. And the same thing with Ireland and Portugal. They both said they didn't want the IMF bailout. And the Irish got it. I'm not sure about Portugal, though. Obama budget cuts misleading, and I think the same thing in Spain too. They didn't want it, but Obama budget cuts misleading. It says U.S. President Barack Obama 2012 budget cut proposal is a move to mislead the American people, says a political and economic analysis. Quote, I think U.S. officials are really misleading the American people. He's relying on the American people not seeing through the mythology of these budget cuts, said Michael Burns, a political, military, and economic analyst from New York, in an interview with Press TV. He went on to say that the spending cuts proposed by Obama have not addressed the needs of the country to try to reduce its deficit. He said what he did was raise his budget numbers in the previous 2 years. In the future years, he's going to cut the raised loaded number by a small amount. Furthermore, many of these cuts will happen when he's left office. And it goes down here, the U.S. debt is currently over $14 trillion and counting, which is pretty much, I think I covered this, equal, if not more, than our GDP, what we're producing. Northeast lawmakers assail Obama's heating aid cuts for the poor. President Bolsonaro proposed to cut nearly half a $5.1 billion home heating aid program for the poor, and has drawn howls from some of his staunchest allies, Northeastern Democrats. Then we have U.S. Medicare. That's because he's not Democrat, he's not liberal. People always say that, and they had the State of the Union address, and what? They were all sitting together, right? Republicans and Democrats. Why? Because there's no difference. They're all the same. And that's why you had Republicans who basically renewed and reauthorized to extend by 3 months the Patriot Act, which basically puts us back to 1930s, early 40s Nazi Germany, basically, right? And so they extended that. So it just goes to show you that they're not on your side, neither of those parties. Even when you go into third parties, they're funded by these people, by these CFR, by these outside global, basically think tanks and private organizations. They support third parties as well. And bet your bottom dollar that eventually, when people get sick and tired of the Republican, Democrat, or the normal left and right dominant parties, they'll start to be, the third parties will be heavily funded by these groups, the George Soros, the CFR, the RAND, the unions will start backing them, and then, yeah. So, anyways, we have U.S. Medicare fraud costs annual $60 billion, and U.S. Medicare fraud alone costs Americans $60 billion annually, while many people hope that Congress will make necessary decisions to cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse. Right. And lastly, how the middle class became the underclass. It says, are you better off than your parents? Probably not if you're in the middle class. Incomes for 90% of Americans have been stuck in neutral, and it's not just because of the Great Recession. It says here, middle-class incomes have been stagnant for at least a generation, while the wealthiest tier has surged ahead of lightning speed. And I've covered, basically all the numbers, all the statistics of how much wealth has been lost in the middle class. I don't even think there really is a middle class. They're mostly middle, lower class. None of them really own anything. They don't really own their cars. They don't own their property. 1 in 4 are basically sinking or drowning in their mortgage. They owe more than the house is worth. Many people, I know my family, my parents, all their pensions are, basically if they do have them, they are under threat, especially in Illinois there. In basically inflation, everything that the Federal Reserve, the policies that they've done, along with the states, have basically destroyed the dollar. And so whatever you do to slave away to earn your money, you're going to be getting less. So you're working harder for less. That's what it is. And that is what the recovery is. It's a restructuring of the economy or the farm, right? They're just updating the farm. And if you can please join me in part 2, we're going to talk about the Middle East crisis. This is GGN, and I'm Darko. Thank you.